Certainly writing its name into the history books. Just yards from the Turkish border, the city is being half overrun by the savages of ISIS.
But every street and every house is being contested by the young Kurdistan fighters of the YPG, which is the youth section of the local chapter of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, listed bizarrely as a terrorist organisation by both the US and EU, who now back the Kurds, of course, the PKK, in the fight against ISIS. The fighters are young, left, and a huge number of them are women. It would be the stuff of a Hollywood movie if it were not for the nightmare of the actuality.
Captured fighters being beheaded, their eyes gouged out, women being raped by the oh-so-holy warriors of the ISIS. 80-year-old men have had their heads cut off in front of their families, children and grandchildren. Sometimes this story moves beyond words, at least any words that I can find. Joining us now is a man of many words, and good ones too, Kurdish activist and writer Mehmed Aksoy. Mehmed, you've got your ear to the ground in and around Kobane. What's the military situation, first of all, there on the ground in the city now?
Well, the most recent information is that the YPG and YPJ, the women's section of the Defence Forces, have taken back 85% of the city. And Saleh Muslim has stated that liberation is very near for Kobane. So positive things are happening on the east and southern fronts. ISIS have been pushed back to almost outside the city. They only control some of the villages that are attached to Kobane and some neighbourhoods on the outskirts of the city. So I think that over the next few days, ISIS will be pushed back even further and hopefully will leave Kobane.
Is that possible? Is a victory possible and a defeat for ISIS possible? And if so, what would be the implications of that? What would happen next?
Well, I think the coalition forces have changed tack. After seeing that Kobane isn't falling, they waited for 2-3 weeks.
Kerry said it wasn't part of their strategy to avoid it falling.
I think with the Turkish state's approach to Kobane and being a NATO member, being part of the coalition wanted Kobane to fall. But when it didn't fall and when international public opinion swung in favour of the Kurds and Kobane, they had to take steps. So now, just yesterday, the Kurdistan Regional Government, Parliament, accepted a motion to recognise the cantons of Rojava, Kobane being one of them, which wouldn't have happened without the Americans giving the go-ahead. Also, ISIS are being defeated in certain parts of Iraq. Certain Sunni tribes have
begun to rise up against them.
Exactly. So I think ISIS are being pushed back on all fronts. And you can see this in the reflection of this in Kobane as well. What will this mean? This will mean that other forces, other powers need to fill in that vacuum. In Rojava, in Kobane, the Kurds already have an administration, they have people, they have fighters. And the same needs to happen in other parts, in Raqqa, in Rabia, in Tel Abyad. So Arab tribes, the other ethnic groups in the region, the other religious groups need to fill in that power vacuum.
Well, we'll talk about the Arabs in a minute. I want to talk about the Turkish position first. It was, I would assume, a matter of shame, consternation certainly, for Turkey's friends and allies in NATO to see a huge Turkish military force at the fence on the border, able to see, if they had field glasses at least, the beheadings and the murders, but not being prepared to lift a finger, and worse, not being prepared to allow the gate to be open so that Turkish Kurds could enter and come to the side of their brethren and sisters fighting there. But the impact amongst the Kurdish public opinion in Turkey has been dramatic, and it now endangers the peace process between the PKK and the Erdogan government. Tell us about that.
Well, the position of the Turkish government, the Erdogan government, for 2 years has been one of supporting the fundamentalist extremist groups in Syria against the Assad regime. They expected the Assad regime to fall very quickly. The Kurds who were fighting the Assad regime since 2004 did not take active arms against Assad. Instead, they built up their own administrations. Turkey were very afraid of this because they thought it would reflect badly, according to them, on the Kurds of Turkey. So they were supporting first the Al-Nusra Front, which
That's
then
the
ISIS
Al-Qaeda affiliate,
which ISIS broke off of. And obviously UK, EU, US governments were also supporting the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian National Coalition against Assad. So all the arms that were provided by these forces went into the hands of these extremist forces. The Kurds, meanwhile, refused to take a part in this because, one, it didn't recognize Kurdish administration, it didn't recognize Kurdish rights and autonomy in northern Syria. So over the last 2 years, the Kurds have been putting up a fight. The international community and media turned a blind eye to it. Turkey was funding, letting these groups through their borders. But in the last 2-3 months, the international media has taken it, paid attention to it, but Turkey hasn't changed its tack. First, it said we've got 49 hostages who were taken in Mosul. That was their excuse.
Then they got them back.
Then they got them back in return for the release of about 180 ISIS members, apparently, who were being held by Turkey. So Turkey were actually negotiating with a terrorist organization. And then, after this excuse was taken away, they still refused, as you said, to let the people across the border because the Kurds wanted a corridor to be opened.
Well, that's it. They want Turkish occupation of the north of Syria.
Yes.
What they call a buffer zone, what anyone else would call an occupation. Presumably the Kurds have no interest in agreeing to that.
No. They want a buffer zone and they want a no-fly zone. Do ISIS have any planes? No. Why do they want a no-fly zone? Against Assad. Turkey, and especially the AKP regime, have banked on a Sunni corridor being opened through Syria, going through Iraq and the rest of the region. They want a Sunni-dominated sectarian divide in the region to serve their own neo-Ottoman purposes or ideology. Their paradigm, the way they see the Middle East, is through this neo-Ottoman prism. And the fall of Assad was going to make this possible for them. But it's worked out exactly in the opposite direction.
Davutoglu was regularly saying, in a matter of weeks, Bashar will fall. And of course, 3 and a bit years on now, he's not fallen. He's not going to fall, at least in those parts of Syria that he and the regime currently hold. Let's talk about the popularity or otherwise of Erdogan's line. The Alevi people are against it. The Kurdish people are against it. The left, such as it is now in Turkey, is against it. One imagines that those elements inside the armed forces that don't like Erdogan don't much fancy a war in Syria. If I'm right about that, then the Erdogan position is quite precarious. He only has, it's a good score, 47%, but it's not a majority, and it's certainly not an overwhelming majority.
No. And also, international forces are also against it now. America, France, the UK are starting to accept a future with Assad rather than without Assad. And this is the key, I think. Apart from internal opposition, external opposition has swung against Erdogan as well. Within Turkey, as with the Gezi protests, as with the recent protests for Kobane, there's a very, very strong opposition against the Erdogan regime, which is becoming ever more authoritarian in its policies as well. Just the other day, they passed a new bill extending the police's kind of rights in what they can do when against protests.
Let's talk about the Arabs then, quickly. The situation in Iraq. There's a new Prime Minister. He's talked a different game from al-Maliki. So far, he hasn't really delivered one. The image of the central state in Baghdad is heavily tarnished by recent years. You say that there are now some signs of the Sunni tribes in the west of Iraq, in the north and west of Iraq, beginning to turn against ISIS. Tell us something about that. That's new.
Well, from what I've read from the media, 3 or 4 tribes have come together. One very important tribe in Deir ez-Zor, I think, in that region, has started fighting ISIS on the ground, on ground level. I think it's very important that these tribes come out and unite and have a strong government behind them to fight extremist forces like ISIS, because that's the only way that, as I said, they can fill in that power vacuum. Otherwise, forces like ISIS, which have fighters from all over the world, I call them international hitmen for finance capital, will continue kind of borrowing into that, into the region if the local people, if the tribes there don't put up a strong stand. This can only happen, though, if things aren't done along, for example, ethnic or religious lines. A sectarian war or kind of taking sides on a sectarian or ethnic along those divides will only lead to more conflict in the future. So, you know, conflicts with Shia Muslims especially, the Kurds, the Turkmen, the Assyrians in that region, the Christians, all have the right to live in that region. And they have to unite against, in this case, a common enemy like ISIS.
Joseph, you were very interested in the youthfulness and, of course, the high female component of this great battle in Kobane, weren't you?
Absolutely, they're a very impressive force, aren't they? But the question is, if there is a victory for them, do you think it will change the circumstance that we're in?
Definitely. The reason why there are so many young people and so many women involved is because of the ideological standpoint of the Kurdish movement. They believe in a gender equal, secular, democratic and communitarian society and system. The reason why these people find their future in this system is because it's not drawn along gender lines, it's not drawn along ethnic or religious lines. And this, the administrations in Rojava, in northern Syria, including Kobane, will bring about a change, will spread this change across the region. People see their future in this system, in this administration, which accepts the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Arabs living there, which gives them the power to decide on their own fate, decide on their own future, and it's localized power. It's the penicillin, if you will, for nation-statism, for patriarchy, for finance capital, industrialism, which is killing the environment and the ecological health of the region, really. So I think that a victory for Kobane, a victory for northern Syria, for the Kurds and the other ethnic groups there, will mean a victory for the rest of the Middle East.
In a nutshell, because we've only got time for a nutshell, chances of PKK being taken off the terror list now?
Well, this is the only way that there's going to be a solution in Turkey. We liken it a little bit to the ANC and to Nelson Mandela's situation. If the EU, if the UK, if the US want peace in Turkey, if they want the war to end, for there to be stability there, not just in Turkey, but in Iran, Iraq and Syria, then the PKK need to be taken off the terrorist list, which will also strengthen the hand of the Turkish state and the Turkish government, because then they won't be in negotiation with a group that's on the terrorist list. And it will also help us Kurdish activists openly do more activism to help democracy in the region as well, because now we're criminalized whenever we try to help the PKK or the Kurdish movement in general. So it's a win-win situation if the PKK are delisted.
Mehmet, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. Coming up after the break, an interview with Dennis Halliday for